from 2005 to 2016, and has also written for The Atlantic, The New Republic, The New Yorker. I'm sure you've seen him on various television stations because he does a lot of that commentary. He's a fellow of the Aspen Institute, an on-air political analyst for MSNBC, and a former McKinsey analyst, which gives him special insight into his subject. As I said, he teaches here, which we're delighted about, and has spoken on the stage of TED. You can look up his TED Talk, which I think you'd find inspiring. His writings have been honored by the Society of Publishers in Asia, the Poynter Fellowship at Yale, and the New York Public Library's Helen Bernstein Award, on which I serve on the committee, and actually was part of that. And he lives in Brooklyn. So anyway, without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome our guests. They're just going to have an informal conversation on the topics that the book raises, and that Larissa has also engaged with. And please.
Thank you, Brooke. So I am very excited to do this because I've been wondering about the questions that Anand addresses for a long time. There's one moment in particular when they really crystallized about, I think, 3 or 4 years ago, when I was on the campus at Stanford and I met an idealistic young woman, very, very much wanted to change the world. She just graduated and she was going to work for Uber. And I found this baffling. And I interrogated her, why Uber? And she said, well, Uber is changing the world. And I was like, well, that's true, but still doesn't really explain it. And then another time at Stanford, I met this young woman named Hillary Cohen, who, again, was fiercely idealistic, brilliant, warm, likable young woman whose first steps on the road to changing the world for the better was to go to McKinsey and Goldman Sachs. And then when I picked up Anand's book, there I see the same Hillary Cohen, and I think this book is going to answer all these questions I've been asking for years, and indeed it did. It was revelatory on so many levels. But before I start asking some more questions, having read the book a couple of times with deep interest, I want you to just give us a lay of the land, because you're going to do this much better than I could. So just tell us the argument of the book and the kinds of people you've been talking to and the conclusions.
Well, first of all, thank you all for being here. It's fun to do this in a place where I teach. There's usually less lights when I teach, but it's really fun to have you all here. So thank you, and to sit next to you. I mean, honestly, for me, like, this is how like an aspiring choir singer feels sitting next to Aretha, one of the truly great writers of our time. So thank you for doing this. The book grew out of a lot of moments similar to the kind you had. And I think these are moments, when I start to say what they are, that you'll all feel like you had them. And they're moments that we often have of cognitive dissonance, of kind of just these weird little details about our age. So every time I went to a store and saw the proliferation of these products that are going to change the world, this iPhone case or this tote bag or those socks, they're going to change the world. I didn't have a huge analysis of it, but there was something in it that felt off, not right. There's something in it that actually made me feel sad about living in an era where that was what was considered changing the world. Every time I had the experiences you had of those idealistic young people, and having frankly had something of that experience myself, that was not exactly my motivation, but knowing young people who were so idealistic, and then into their 8th year of a 2-year stint at Goldman Sachs, learning to change the world, that was a detail that arrested me and left me with that kind of intellectual heartburn. And then every time I heard, and we've had so many headlines like in the last couple of weeks, and I'm so grateful to these billionaires for doing this to us, for me, for my book promotion, like Uber donating $10 million to help the congestion problem, even though it also caused it. You know, Larry Fink of BlackRock this week lecturing the United Nations, here in New York on sustainable development. Larry Fink runs BlackRock, the largest asset management company in the world. He got very famous recently for making a statement that all businesses need a higher purpose, all businesses. When the biggest asset manager in the world says that, it was earthquakes. Stocks plummeted, other stocks rose. It sounded for a moment like if you weren't a company with a social purpose, BlackRock might not own equity in you in the future, which might mean like you'd be dead, right? Big moment. He got great press. This new Wall Street, Barron's post, he's leaning like this. Is Larry Fink the new conscience of Wall Street? Reaped all the press, right? This week, addressing the UN as a result of that press. But during the last 6 months, as he was getting this press, his BlackRock bought 4 million new additional shares of ExxonMobil, right? That's just one example. I'm just telling you the kind of example. And we saw Bezos giving money away recently while people were saying, well, why don't you just pay your taxes and pay your workers more, et cetera, et cetera. And so there was a lot of just cognitive dissonance about my age and about what I felt to be a phony story about change that didn't match. I was a history major. It didn't match what I'd learned about change growing up. It didn't match the stories of how women won suffrage or how African Americans won civil rights or how immigrants won the right to be in this country in a safe and stable way. It just didn't match. Something was being denuded from the idea of change. And often irritation becomes a book. And I think this is a case of like sustained irritation becoming a book. And the bridge between irritation and the book is hopefully reporting. So the book originated in a speech that I gave at the Aspen Institute. I was asked to be a fellow there. It's mostly business people who are asked, but they throw in a couple people for spice and entertainment every year, because business people can be a little boring. And they had us in there, and I just, again, this whole thing of like, why are we in the Coke seminar building, named after the brother, not the beverage, talking about making democracy better? Why are we in the Pepsi on Monsanto-sponsored Ideas Festival, Aspen Ideas Festival, talking about like empowering kids? Like, you are fattening kids while we are here in Aspen. You're fattening kids everywhere who are not here. And they asked me to give a talk about my previous book, which was about a hate crime. I said yes, and then I sent them an email saying, I'm going to change it slightly. I wrote a new talk that was about how millionaires and billionaires who gather at the Aspen Institute are the embodiment of the problem, not the embodiment of the solution, as they claim. And I gave that talk to a room full of 400 super rich people. Some of them sat on their hands. Some of them gave me a standing ovation. One woman who's a billionaire came up to me and said, thank you for voicing what's been the struggle of my whole life that I can never tell anybody. Another guy, private equity investor, came up to me that night at the bar and said, you're an asshole, and then shook my hand. So out of that speech, the speech grew out of those irritations and that cognitive dissonance, and then the book grew out of that speech.
Oh, it's such a good book. I mean, I'm sure I've been seeing lots of nods, so I think everyone has had similar.
Look, everybody has that tote bag.
Similar, yes.
And everybody
yes,
knows that
yes.
they didn't actually change the world by buying it.
Yes.
So.
Well, so I mean, I've been baffled and frustrated by a kind of, and I'm sure many people in this room too, Silicon Valley is one of the places where this stuff gets most ripe, where billionaires and those who work for them think that they're changing the world for the good because they are literally changing the world in the sense of putting things there that didn't used to be there. And yet, since 2016 election, as we know, this has been somewhat deflated because of the role Facebook played in the election. Have you had conversations with people in Silicon Valley since the election? Like, how has that particular flavor of faux utopianism changed?
I actually think it's not even confined to that. I mean, I'm starting with this point, so you have to trust me that I hate Donald Trump more than anybody in America, or maybe tied with all the rest of you, but, and I don't have many good things to say about him. However, I think Trump has done us an enormous service as a country that gets to the question you ask, which is, I found this actually even while writing the book, which was 2015, 2016, 2017, even during the reporting, and now certainly after. I think a lot of people who know, a lot of what I'm writing about is really elite self-justification, right? Is people who are trying to do things and save things and change things, but it's fundamentally self-preservational, self-protective, and fundamentally about keeping oneself on top. And so it requires a wall of rationalizations. What I found as Trump got closer and closer and then started serving, and my reporting spanned that whole period basically, into, let's say, the first summer of his presidency. What I found was that there are very few events that can make powerful people open to introspection about their own deepest convictions, right? There are very few things, because they're powerful, because there's not a lot of people in their lives who tell them they're full of shit, et cetera, et cetera. And so it takes big things, either in their personal life. So like a very common thing I found in this book is like, rich people getting cancer is often a spur to like changing their lives. And so you have these epic personal events, things happening with your children are off. But here was something on this scale that I started to find was actually making these very self-justifying people say, sometimes privately, sometimes to me in the book, if this is happening, maybe we're all wrong about everything, right? Like, maybe the assumptions that I have, like, at some level, I mean, it's easy for people like us sitting here in New York to be like, man, those racist white people in Alabama really got this guy elected. But the math doesn't work.
Right.
And particularly if you go beyond the electoral thing to talk about conditions in this country that allowed this to happen, like, you don't get a Trump in a country this extraordinary without there being 18 massive system failures in parallel that were uncorrelated, that all happened at the same time, right? And so I think there's a lot of people who I've found are like, okay, maybe I'm all wrong about everything. Let's have a conversation. And that is actually, I want to say in Donald Trump's defense, a really beautiful thing. I don't know what we're going to do with it, but I have found more people, I mean, really, really rich people thinking about like, maybe we do need a confiscatory estate tax. I don't think we do, but maybe I'm wrong. And I think there's a maybe I'm wrong moment here about a lot of different things. And as Rahm Emanuel said, I think, never let a good crisis go to waste. Never let a crisis of the elite soul go to waste. We should make sure we're taking advantage of this moment.
Well, I mean, I want to ask you about that because, I mean, on the one hand, it's clearly the case. You talk about that in certain elite circles, talking about poverty is more acceptable than talking about inequality because poverty is something that will always be with us, and you can address it privately with your own charity, and it doesn't threaten structures in the way that talk of inequality does. On the other hand, inequality has become a very fashionable buzzword in those same circles, and Thomas Piketty's book was a huge bestseller, which was not just oppressed people buying it. I'm sure it was a lot of these same people buying it. And so I think there are a lot of people who ought to be made uncomfortable by talk of inequality, but are not, in fact, made uncomfortable. And I'm thinking about also the reception that your talk got at Aspen. You set out to uncover and make uncomfortable the people in that room, but a lot of them gave you a standing ovation. So can you tell us about, you spend time with these people, what kind of rationalizations and sort of double ways of thinking go on to enable those same people to talk very fluently and enthusiastically about inequality and yet do not much about it?
I mean, one thing I found, if you like lurk around the darker parts of Reddit and you try to understand like what's the reigning theory of the world here, it's a view in which rich people are, in the tall towers of New York and San Francisco, like having conversations over cigars and whiskey about how to make people's lives worse. Right? And what I found is that's not true. There are some people like that. But what I found that in some ways is scarier for just all of us as human beings is there's actually a lot of rich people who and I got behind a lot of enemy lines and gates and found out about things that I wasn't even at, and like rich people spend a lot of time, at least in our time, and there are historical precedents, thinking about how to make other people's lives better. And what I found was a lot of decent people upholding a profoundly indecent system that they have reason to know is indecent. And so the question then becomes, what's the bridge that allows decent people to uphold an indecent system? And to get to your point, that bridge is a whole set of beliefs. You need, the decent people couldn't live with themselves if they didn't have the scaffolding of these beliefs to uphold, because they would hurt them too much. And so this book in many ways is an attempt to dismantle the phony beliefs that allow decent people to uphold the indecent system. So let's just to rattle some of them off. At the heart of it, I think everything in the book is about one of these ideas, which is the win-win. right? The win-win. A win-win is an idea that's totally fine that emerges from commercial exchange. Like, you have ice cream, I have money, I want ice cream, we make a deal. That's a win-win, particularly with ice cream. And there's no disputing that. I don't think that's fake, like that's real. And that's an idea basically from trade. What has happened in our time is the idea of the win-win has been like dragged into the idea of social change, so that social change is now expected to be a win-win. So one of the ways these decent people uphold an indecent system is they insist more and more that the kind of social change that matters, that would help people, that would really be the right thing to do, are win-wins. And what win-wins means is it should help those people, but it should certainly not hurt, and maybe even kick something upstairs to the powerful also, right? So what that means, you take any issue, like the empowerment of women, there's like the stuff that would actually work based on other countries' experience, like maternity leave at the level of policy, or just other social policies like child care tax credits, or like not creating laws that make it less likely for women to be groped in the office every day or by Supreme Court justices. And instead, well, all those things I said, they're costly for men. They're costly for the winners. They would cost billionaires a lot of money to do all those things. So they're not win-wins, right? They're win-lose in a certain sense. And to help millions of people, some people would have to sacrifice something. That discourse has totally been overtaken by the idea of like win-win. So what's win-win feminism? Lean in. You know why it's a win-win? Because I just told you to do it, and now we're done. Now you just do it. Didn't cost a dime. No powerful person. No man has to stop standing on any woman's neck. You just say win-win. You can even say win-win to the woman while you're standing on her neck. Rich people don't have to change anything they're doing. They don't have to stop hurting women or hurting poor people or hurting minorities in any way. They can just tell you to empower yourself or do one charter school while keeping everybody else in bad public schools or whatever. And that's just one example of this belief that's totally easy to see why people fall for it. Win-win. It's like two victories, not one. But the more truthful version of win-win maybe captured by the Goldman Sachs elevator Twitter account, which was supposedly at one time an account of things overheard in that elevator for real. I don't know if this is real. And the line was, a win-win is when I beat you twice.
Yeah. I mean, yes, that is one of the brilliant things about this book is the way he describes this, because he just, Anand takes things that there's sort of the problem that we all swim in every day, and then he exposes the sort of underpinnings and what those cliches entail. But I have to say, I was cringing when I found myself, when I read your description of a certain mindset, a certain this win-win, optimistic, let's think constructively rather than critically, let's unite, let's not divide, let's all work together in a way that no one has to lose. I found myself thinking about Obama, and I thought, is there some way in which, in a sort of, I guess, parallel way to the way that you described Trump shocking and everyone into realizing how they were wrong, that Obama's style of uniting politics helped this mindset continue?
I think rhetorically that's fair. I mean, I think the situation of the first African American president was such that I think he was denied the use of anger because of our cultural faults that are not his faults. And I think of what to my mind is a very useful and important tool in politics, anger, even a little accurate scapegoating.
Right.
I'm a fan of a politics that in an accurate way, makes enemies of actual enemies.
Right.
I don't think he could do that.
Yeah.
Because of who he was. And you could even just see those moments when Michelle had a little more of that in her constitutionally, and you saw how she was treated. Anytime you got a glimpse of that out of her, it was she was treated so much worse than him. So, but I think setting that aside, I think a lot of his policies, many of his policies, some of the tax stuff in Obamacare, did hurt the rich. But in a way, because he couldn't sell it that way, there's this way in which the left has refused to be a mirror image to the right, and there's a lot of ways in which you don't want to be a mirror image to the right, but I actually think there are some ways in which it would be useful. I think it'd be useful to love government as much as the right hates it. Instead of say, we totally get that you hate government, and yes, it's awful, but we can bend the cost curve down on healthcare, and and it would cover some people, but like, I actually think it's harder to do that than be like, government is amazing, healthcare, life is so much better when you never have to think about your healthcare again, and like, fight hard. I think sometimes the equal opposite position is actually the better. And partly because of but it's not just his race and his predicament. I think he's just also he's not a flamethrower.
Right.
Right? And I think there's a reason that like Bernie, who was like, to my mind, like kind of personally unappealing a figure and not a kind man by many people's account in some, in like personal, just like someone who rubbed a lot of people the wrong way at that personal level, was able to connect with so many people because he was willing to connect those policies to like people who'd stood on other people's necks. And I think if you exclude that from the story, if you exclude, like a lot of what I found, I still find like on this book tour is like, people are like, well, why do you have to name what's wrong? Why can't we just move forward, And I finally found a way to shut these people up, which I'm gonna try out on you tonight. I say, in like political economy, there's two kinds of problems. You think of social problems we have in this society, there's two kinds of problems, right? One is problems that are like an engine, comparable to an engine, right? Where you tweak things, you dial things, you shift some things, and you can fix the engine. And so I think if you went to Chicago public schools and you found that the teachers best able to fix, classrooms that were needing the most remedial help were assigned to the wrong classrooms, and you could do an algorithm, and you could evaluate, and you could match teachers better, and everybody's performance could go up. That's a real thing, and there are many problems like that. Great, win-win, tweak, dial. But a bunch of other problems in a society are more like a crime scene than an engine, right? And a crime scene is like you have a problem, but you have a problem because someone did something to someone else.
Right.
And you do not show up at a crime scene and say, you know what, guys, let's just move forward. let's just what's done is done. Let's focus on solutions. We all know that you don't focus on solutions at a crime scene. But somehow, when you have the mass crime scene of gender inequality, right? When you have the mass crime scene of poor kids systematically shut out of equal education by the fact that we fund education according to home values and ring fence like rich people's house values like into their public school area. Like, those are all crimes, in my view. They're not punch someone in the subway crimes, they're worse. They're more diffuse, but they're much bigger, and they hurt way more people. And they, like, through indirect ways, kill people and shorten people's lives and make people's lives impossibly hard. And it's a different kind of brutality. And my kind of big thesis here is that those kind of problems are not susceptible to win-win solutions. They can't be, because someone's standing on someone's neck. And you can't, like, the only answer is to get that person off the neck. The first thing is to, like, stop standing on their neck, right? And then you can move forward. But right now, you can't build a charter school for someone and save poor kids, because you're still standing on their neck by insisting that your property taxes in Greenwich don't go to them, right? And you can't have your cake and give it too.
So I completely agree with all that. Sometimes the thing that worries me is I can support government 100% in theory, but sometimes your government is not so great. And sometimes your government, for instance, is deregulating the energy industry at a speed that is threatening the planet. And the only thing that seems to stand between you and the apocalypse is Tom Steyer. What do you do?
Call Tom Steyer, I guess. I think it's a very good question. It's one that obviously comes up a lot now. So I say a couple things. Nowhere in the book do I say we should stop giving, stop capitalism, stop. I mean, people, people who work in some of these spaces like fantasize that that's what I've said, but I have a pretty good editor who made sure I didn't say that. What I wrote in my drafts is up to me. And the way I think about what I'm saying is like, when you're standing on your feet and you shift your weight from one foot to the other, you're still standing on 2 feet. Both your feet are still on the ground, but there's a shift in your weight. There's a shift in emphasis, a substantial shift, possibly. I am, in a way, advocating for a shift in weight from the private to the public in American life, right? I'm calling for a shift in like the emphasis of the age, the tendency of the age. That does not mean there will be no private business, that people won't be giving, et cetera, et cetera. It just means that like at the margin, the average young people with idealism will go run for a county executive position instead of go to Goldman Sachs. It just means that at the margin, next time any of you see a problem with public schools, you won't think of joining the board of a charter school, you'll think about fighting that lawsuit to make unequal public school funding unconstitutional. It just means that we'll look for solutions that are public, democratic, universal, and institutional next time we see something that bugs us. So on your specific thing, like, yeah, if there is emergencies, and if there are issues that frankly need to be addressed right now and can't be addressed by local government, like climate change, yeah, like, do it. I still think there are ways for those people to do it that aggrandize themselves and ways to do it that actually put communities first. There's ways to, fight climate change by someone like Mike Bloomberg that would, that would help, that would have someone like Mike Bloomberg overcome his own biases and not necessarily need to be the CEO of it, give the money to people doing the best work. But yeah, sure, like, but the other thing, climate change is a very specific example where like there's no way to not do that work right now. But the other problem I have is we all use Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, and Donald Trump as like an excuse to not do public service. You know how many government entities there are in the United States? 90,000. 90,000 government entities. All but 3 of them not controlled by Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, and Donald Trump, right? And that's where I think we all become more complicit. Like, how many people you know run for those boring, like, county clerk jobs? And like, how many people who feel very strongly about mass incarceration, like, actually run for, like, not attorney general, but like local prosecutor, either just work as local or run for local judges, or, those kind of things. Like, there's been a neglect of all levels of government by people who claim to want to change the world that I think can't be explained away by the dysfunction on the top. And the last thing I'll say about the Bloomberg Sires is I think there's a way for them to give. I end the book by talking about with this woman, Chiara Cordelli. It's very rare to like give your last words as a writer to someone else. It's not always, it's for me, it's written a book. But I was just like, her words are better than mine. I'm just going to go out on Chiara Cordelli's words. And the reason I did that was she just says so eloquently, like, the fact that government is bad, I'm not saying it eloquently now, I'm just summarizing it, but the fact that government is bad is not an excuse to stay out of government. That is the reason to dive in. And so when you're doing these gifts on climate, whatever, and you're working around, there's still ways to work around that, as she would put it, create the conditions for us to govern ourselves better down the road, which may be 20 years from now. There's ways to do that on climate. Let's say you're spending $20 billion on climate. There's ways to do that in the work of funding that would train thousands of local leaders around this country in civic life. And there's ways to do it that would be like you running a program from Bloomberg Philanthropies to stop climate change. What I'm saying is at every opportunity, think about how do you give in ways that actually do 2 things. 1, put your own privilege at risk, shift from giving back to actually giving something up. And 2, shift from crowding government out to crowding it in, so that next time, the sugar daddy and sugar mommy is not needed.
Well, there's another area of this that drives me crazy, and I'm guessing it drives you crazy, so I wonder what you would say about this. There was a story I heard about a conversation, a meeting in the Open Society Institute, George Soros's foundation, in which there was a debate going on about how best to, what to donate to, how best to spend money. And at a certain point, apparently, Soros shut down the debate saying, look, in the end, it's my money, so I'm going to decide where to give it. And a staffer said, actually, it's not your money. Half of it is your money, and the other half is the taxpayers' money, because of the tax relief, that is money that you would not have if it weren't channeled through this foundation. And I was wondering what you think about the charitable tax the charitable tax relief deduction. Do you think it should be abolished? Because, you know, when it's not only a kind of plutocratic situation when rich people get to decide the course of, let's say, charter schools, our educational system, by donating large amounts of money according to what they believe is best, but it's also us who's subsidizing this.
Correct.
What do you think? Should we eliminate it?
So it's a very important issue. So I'm of two minds about it. So one thing is, first of all, I don't think many people know this. And to put it in a more dramatic, I mean, we all know we have the deduction, but to put it in a slightly more dramatic way, all of you work longer hours every year and make more money than you would otherwise need to in order to pay taxes, more taxes, to subsidize those rich people claiming the charitable tax deduction.
Right.
Right? So when Bezos gives $2 billion, if he claims it, right? So the government's now lost, the government's down $1 billion or $800 million, right? Like, they got to get that from someone, you. So I think, first of all, we just need to understand that, like, we are choosing to subsidize up. We do that in many ways, like how we subsidize private jets but not daycare. So I think in that sense, like, there's no justification for it. The more interesting proposal that I have made, and, you know, I make a lot of proposals, but I don't think I have a single record of anyone being implemented yet. So, but they say I have no solution. I have some solutions. I just don't have good ones. But I think one thing that's interesting is if we made it a sliding scale, like those yoga classes. So basically, the way it would work is if your donation was public-spirited in a few ways that I'll say in a second, you can get the full deduction. And if it's not public-spirited, if it's more if it's still kind of benefiting you, you know, then you get no deduction, right? And how do we judge public-spirited? So a couple things. If you put your name on it, it's not philanthropy. I mean, you're purchasing, it's a swap, right? You're giving away money and you're getting a name on a building. That's a purchase. That's totally a fine thing to purchase, but it's like me buying shoes, right? If I had that much money, instead of buying shoes, or in addition to buying shoes, I would just buy my name on the New York Public Library. So that's fine if you want to buy that, and like good for the New York Public Library that got, I don't know, $500 million for that or whatever it was. But like that's a purchase. That's not so no deduction. If you insist on controlling how the money's spent, again, that's not charitable. That's you purchasing, like you're older and you don't have stuff to do and you've now bought the right to sit on a board and like you've bought some interesting work for yourself to go 4 times a year and like explain to these people how to run their organization. Fine, good for you that you enjoy that, but you've bought something. You've bought a service, which is like the service that makes you feel useful. No deduction. If in that or any other ways, if you're crowding out government, you know, we could figure out how to scale it, evaluate it rather. No deduction. If, on the other hand, you don't put your name on it, no one knows about it, you're purely giving to others, you let communities or government authorities actually administer the program, and you actually strengthen their muscles of self-government next time. If you do what philanthropists did 100 years ago, Carnegie was a famous example, which is you actually use your private donation contractually to force the government to do more of what you're just testing out on an ongoing basis. So he's actually made them sign contracts with him to like raise taxes and fund his libraries on an ongoing basis. Not like he couldn't afford the libraries. He wanted to use a small donation as a catalysis to make government do more stuff. If you do that, you get the deduction, right? I think if we did that, we'd get more of the kind of giving that is actually of benefit to us as society. And we'd get less of the kind of giving that's about putting your name on things, rich-splaining to people how to run their programs, and like aggrandizing yourself at the expense of the public good.
Larissa, Anand, I think it's the moment to open this to questions, because
Okay.
I'm sure people have plenty. So again, I'm going to ask you to come to the mic over there. There's a very bright light in your eyes when you get there, so maybe shield. And just line up, and we'll take as many as we can over the next 15 minutes. Please.
Hi, how you doing?
How are you?
Good.
One of my students?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on my recent email. So I was wondering if you could tell us more about the conversations with your editor about critiquing capitalism as a system, et cetera. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, it was a very interesting.
Thank you, Jess.
It was a very interesting thing because, you know, my editor some years older than me, and really came of age at a time when this fake change had not taken over. I mean, he came of age at a time when there was still real change, and people still got in buses and went to Mississippi and did stuff, and put themselves at risk to help other people. So, at one level, I think he was like, yeah, whatever you're writing about and describing is crazy that people think that this is change, and he was all for it. And I don't think substantively I don't think politically we particularly disagreed. I think just as an editor, which is different from your personal beliefs, as the professional skill of an editor, he was very determined that I be heard, right? Which is a tactical matter more than so everything that one problem that we edited out of the book was that when you're spending time in some of these worlds, I went on a cruise ship with 3,000 entrepreneurs called Summit at Sea, right? I went there so you didn't have to. And it is easy when writing that, to be mean.
You were so restrained.
I had 3 chapters on that cruise ship in my original draft. It's down to 1. And the reason, I privately still read some of those 3 chapters. I mean, there was some nice material in there, but it's not just that it was going to piss people off. It wasn't me at my best, and it wasn't. They're easy shots versus actually trying to make people see reality in a different way, and it just wasn't. It wasn't really what I was doing. I wasn't just trying to be snarky. I have Twitter for that. At my best in this book, I'm trying to make my main audience of this book is regular people, take change back from these pretenders. But I had some hope that a minority of people within these very elite spaces who do have power right now actually, and I know this from experience, actually don't like the systems they're standing on top of. And I thought it was important to write it in a way where you might poach some of them.
Right.
And so a lot of the editing was just no one was against strong claims. They were against strong claims that didn't have enough evidence. That didn't come, let the material do it. Let the reporting do it. Don't hang out to dry by yourself with some crazy opinion that you're not going to be able to justify. And that's always good training.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm an education advocate, and I think your formula for distinguishing what should be considered charitable and get a deduction from those that shouldn't be doesn't really make any sense. We have a lot of billionaires who are trying to remake public education, and one of the ways they do it is they go into communities and they say, I'm going to spend $100 million to help you rate teachers via test scores. And then the district will spend $200 million trying to do it, and it doesn't work, and it demoralizes teachers, and it actually makes schools worse. And at the same time, they buy consent through their money and influence and by tremendous donations to various think tanks and advocacy groups, which back that up with various rationales about why this is good for public schools. So in a sense, when you're pressuring government to institute a certain policy, which really doesn't have a strong evidence base and doesn't really make any sense, you are participating in the reins of government and you are forcing them to spend money, but you're making things worse rather than better. So it really, it's
Yeah,
Is there a question?
Yeah, I understand your point. I think you're misunderstanding. I actually agree with you. I'm trying to limit their influence over public things. I do not think they should get a deduction if they have influence. My point about, there's this framework at Stanford about, is this giving contributory to democracy or disruptive of it? And the simple measure of that is, does the giving result in this amount of public goods end up being larger or smaller? I don't think they should have control in being able to say, do this program or that, but I think you could evaluate them for, does their giving result in the state doing more or the state doing less? And if it results in the state doing more, that's good. And
yeah, but in this case, the district was
let's go to
spending more
multiple.
money on something which wasn't doing good. That's the issue.
Right, but to me, the problem in that story is they controlled what the deed was, and I don't
Thank
think
you.
they should have that control.
So if any of the many individuals who are going to run for the Democratic nomination for president come to you and ask you for advice, if they say to you, Ahmad, based on your very popular book, give me one proposal.
You're overestimating the
Give
popularity.
me one
of my book.
proposal. They will quit. Give me one proposal that I can best highlight that can have value for me in my campaign, and if I get elected president, that if I pursue, I can make some real change? Give me one proposal.
I think probably the thing that's most easily saleable as a matter of fairness and rights, and also a good idea that would do a lot in this era of globalization automation, is just radical equality around public schooling. It's hard for me to think about any other issue that encoded in the law still today. We have basically like class segregation in education that is de facto racial segregation. It's still on the books through this property tax thing. So if there was one, and I think when you actually talk to people about it, it offends every American's sense of decency. I think that's a very powerful issue that almost no Democrat talks about, because actually, what are those really high per pupil spending districts? They're actually not Republican districts. Some of them are, but it's Greenwich, and it's Marin, and it's Westchester, and it's actually elite liberal districts. And I think that's an issue to run. And the second thing I'd say as a more general philosophical thing is like run, as I said before, like make people love government again. That doesn't mean bad government, doesn't mean the DMV, but like tell the story. Like when was the last time you got sick eating in a restaurant in this country? In most countries in the world, like that's not something you can take for granted. Like we have an extraordinary civilizational accomplishment we are sitting on top that we take for granted. Like tell the story of government again. I think we're actually ripe for a new story about government the same way they told an amazing, compelling, and awful story about how government was awful.
Let's keep them going because I see the line is long. So short, crisp.
Lightning, we're going to do lightning round.
Yeah, lightning rounds.
You got to make yours lightning round questions also, though.
First, thank you for writing the book and shining a spotlight on, I think, a really important topic. I want you to talk a little bit about some.
Let's get a little closer to the mic.
Sure. It's so bright here that you're not the only one shining a spotlight. I want you to talk a little bit more about some of the international dimensions of this, because a lot of the examples you've used tonight are really from the domestic sphere. And you can take that where you want, but I guess I'm thinking particularly about the charitable contribution. In the US context, that actually has enabled a lot of philanthropy to go to international causes. And frankly, if we just reliant on public sources, there's just not that much support in the US for north-south income transfer. I'm just curious about potential negative
So I chose, it's a good question. So I chose to write the book focused on the US for the following reason, that the world is like too big and too much. And I think a lot of this giving, and I say this in the book, has done great things for other countries. And I think particularly when you're talking about other countries that don't have effective governments, don't have the kind of systems that could ever combat some of the problems that we're talking about in those countries, I think there's some actually kind of redistributive justice in like the former like descendants of Northern Europe sending money to those countries. And I think there's often problems with how aid is done, and there's been a bunch of books about that. But that's not what I'm taking on. I am taking on all these rich people in this country who've watched their own country's dream unravel and who have tried to step into that and have hurt. So maybe we need to think about if we do this is why no one follows my policy ideas, but like maybe we need an exemption for foreign stuff. I don't know. But I think the issues that I'm concerned about fundamentally are issues of democracy. And those are less, once you're dealing with more than one country, it's just less of a democratic issue and more of a kind of colonial dynamic, or are those people listening on the ground, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm really concerned about why do we spend so much time enforcing one person, one vote, and then give some people 8 million votes through philanthropy?
Next.
Two quick bullet questions based on your conversation.
Can we do your best one?
Okay, best one. We'll start with, well, I don't know if this is the best one, but anyway. You asked about, Larissa asked you about Obama as maybe being the origin of this kind of thinking, but I think it's the Clinton years and triangulation in the third way in the 90s as the beginning of this. And I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, I don't think it began with either of them. I think both of them were symptoms of it. I mean, this began in the 70s, and there's a very well-documented history. I mean, Jane Mayer's book, Dark Money, is one of the great books of our time, and so important for understanding where we are today. And that book really documents basically this really interesting moment in the 70s when there was a real fear that communism was going to win, and that had created a spillover effect in the culture where people hated business people. And if you look at the 1% share of the nation's income, it was at a low. It was about 10, 12% in that period, and it had been since the 40s, but some of that was because of the war, and then now we're not in a war anymore, and it was like still there and even getting smaller. And there was this real worry. And there's this thing called the Powell Memo, where Lewis Powell, before getting on the Supreme Court, wrote this memo basically warning business interests, like organize, capture government, get your shit together. And they did. So that's where it started. It started with the anti-70s, anti-tax movements. I mean, they did an amazing, I think something that's hard in politics is to respect other people's game if you don't like what they're doing. I think it's like really important that we learn to respect people's game. They did an amazing job. They made poor people hate the estate tax that only taxes super rich people. They, you got, hate the outcome, but that is good. That is real good. And I don't know, I feel like we gotta learn to do that for our stuff, right? Redefine terms, make people, and so it started with that. And I think in terms of your Clinton and Obama thing, one of the things that happens when revolutions succeed and win is that everybody who then plays within the regime that results is like playing within that regime. And so even the dissidents or the opposition, they're still living in the era they're living in. So we are living in the Reagan era. It's just the really late stages of it, right? The same way Nixon was living in the FDR era, right? Which is why Nixon created the EPA. He was a Republican, he didn't love big government, but he lived in the FDR era. So the form that took, he was working within the premises of someone who thought government should be huge, and so the opposition was like, government should be sort of big, right? Whereas now we're operating within government should not exist. That's the dominant frame of our time, and it's evil and it's predatory. And so Clinton says the era of big government's over. That's the softer liberal opposition version of government's evil. The era of big government is over, but the era where we let citizens fend for themselves must never return or something. And then Obama, I write about in the book, when he created the first new office he created, maybe the only new office he created, the Office of Social Innovation. Interesting right? That whole social innovation is government's not going to do stuff, let's find people who are doing. It's very Bezosian, you could say. And there was a statement, I was reporting the book, I went to his website. My wife had interned in that office, in 2009, first year of the presidency. And I was looking up the website of that office a couple years ago. And there was a statement that took my breath away. It says, we're doing the Office of Social Innovation because top-down programs from Washington don't work anymore. You're thinking, community organizer from Chicago, liberal, he could only vote because of a top-down program from Washington. A very good top-down program from Washington that wasn't that long ago. It's become the water in which we swim, right? It's become there's this secondhand smoke version of government's bad. Probably most people in this room don't think government's evil, but probably all of us in this room have participated in some way in this culture that just kicks it to the side. Every time you hear a well-meaning 19-year-old being like, well, if you want to change the world right now, you start a business. That's not Reagan, but they're living in Reagan land, right? And part of what I'm calling for is to end the Reagan era and figure out what the next era is, which I call the age of reform.
We can take about 3 more. If
I
you
think
go-
we have 3 more. Or no.
We have 3 more?
Yeah.
Good.
Okay, great.
But
Hello.
keep it short.
Hi, Anna. I will. Hi, Anand. Hi, Larissa. Big fan.
Me
I
too.
was wondering, yes, the choir boy over here. I was wondering, you've given a TED Talk, you've been an Aspen Fellow, you're on a book tour, you're speaking to audiences around the country, you are you're on TV, you're becoming a thought leader of sorts.
Oh, God.
And,
Just stab me, it'd be so much faster.
Well, you must have had that thought
Mhm.
at some point yourself, and I wonder how you grapple with that and how you check yourself from becoming a part of the problems that you
Yeah.
expose.
I think I wrote the book to grapple with that and to write myself out of the problem. And I will only find out later if I succeeded in writing myself out of the problem. I think part of what bothered me and made me so angry is if I'm right about that fish in the water, we're all living, it's hard to not be part of your time. Everybody's part of their time. And to be totally honest, I don't like a lot of TED Talks. I find they have an ideology of solutionism that bothers me. I also live in an era in which it's been very hard to find ways to get your work out, right? I live in an era in which as a journalist who's not been among the most successful of my time, but also not among the least successful, I've struggled many, many years of my life, including recently, to have a platform to put my work in. So, you know, because newspapers have half the staff and even less of the money, and you know, everybody is an adjunct at universities now, including me at this university, and like a lot of the people who did thinking for a living 30 years ago just had institutional support for doing that, and it's all gone. And that's just like one of the ways in which a lot of people who give TED Talks have problems with TED Talks, but like it'll also get your work to people. And so a lot of people I wrote about are in versions of that dilemma, and I became interested in like, how do you navigate that? How do you live in your time, but also question your time? And how do you be a realist about the institutions being what they are, and also live for there being different types of institutions? And you know, I cut myself out of a lot of the worlds that I was in. I think this book has, you know, hurt some of the people who would have thought that I was in their camp when I never was, but I was affiliated with some of their communities or fellowships or whatever. And all I can hope is that I wrote my way out of it.
Thank you. Last two, quick.
Hi, Anand. So I spent 15 years working in social change, starting out in local government, two local governments, and then nonprofit, racial justice, and then also 5 years in philanthropy. And philanthropy was this kind of ivory tower, you know, where all the money flowed to the work that we were doing. But it was really like spending time inside of it. I mean, it's very white, and it's very rich, and it's very business. Increasingly, it was business driven, with the speak of business kind of filtering into nonprofit work and all of that. And, you know, we're talking about government and, you know, other bodies trying to be more representative, you know, of the population, of the body. And so to what extent is like the realm of philanthropy, and I went to so many meetings and so many things about diversifying, and didn't see any of that happen during my 5 years in that. Like, to what extent is the realm of philanthropy kind of complicit in kind of perpetuating this, in making corporate donors feel like they are more than, greater than, more knowledgeable?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I would say two things. One, the very structure of philanthropy in many cases reinforces and accentuates the power relationship that philanthropy is setting out to solve. And this is a common pattern where the solution replicates the problem, right? So a relationship of wealthy white people, like with their hands like this, and needy black and brown people with their hands like this, like, I mean, it's hard to think about a worse way into solving those problems. But I'd say a further thing, which is, another part of me says, like, I don't expect what are essentially clubs of wealthy people hanging out to be any different than that, right? I would spend less energy trying to diversify philanthropy. I just think, like, rich people hanging out in a club is always going to look like rich people hanging out in a club, and it's never going to be diverse. I don't know why we'd expect it to be diverse. I actually find it a little bit of a waste of time, all these efforts to, like, it's like trying to make Marie Antoinette's, like, kingdom more, I mean, a palace more diverse. That's not the problem, right? Like, I just think those people should not be solving public problems, or have much less of a voice in doing so. We have institutions that represent us. They're not great right now. They're better than we sometimes think. I mean, this country is still functioning, right? And I think, like, we have a system that is designed to, it's funny, there's this joke in, like, San Francisco, like, someone's like, Uber's gonna end up like inventing public transport and thinking invented it. Like, okay, so it's like Uber, but we're gonna do like larger, like do buses, and then everyone will just pay like a standard fee, and then you just get on and off whenever you want, and you know, and actually the government will subsidize it with a tax, and like we're just gonna get back to like right where we started. And I sometimes feel like that with philanthropy, like, okay, well, let's make it more representative of the community. Okay, maybe we'll have people in the local community like choose people to allocate the funds. And it's like, yeah, like Congress, or like city council, like state, right? Like, let's just actually use the thing we have to solve problems, which are still very good ideas regardless of who occupies them right now.
Thank you. All right, last one. Is there one more? Make it good.
No pressure.
No
Right.
pressure.
Can you clarify your comments about Bernie? You said you don't really like Bernie.
I did not say that.
Okay, can you clarify your comments about that? And Bernie notwithstanding, who's your like ideal Democratic candidate for the next couple elections?
I did not say I don't like Bernie. What I said was, I think Bernie, I was trying to actually underline how remarkable Bernie's success was, given the difficulties of being a white man in his 70s who, almost uniquely in American politics, did not care for the little niceties of holding people's babies and making small talk and waving and saying, thanks for being, and doing all that. A guy who just like came, gave his message and left. Like the fact that he won, I don't know, 22 states, whatever it was. All I'm saying is I think you have to bake into Bernie's results. Like Bernie would have won 10 more states if he was like Barack Obama, right? Like just as a matter of like person, right? He was, it's like the Larry David portrait on Saturday Night Live. He's like your irascible uncle. He knows that. Like I'm not saying anything that's out of school here. Like, and I think the fact that as a socialist who was very old, had no foreign policy experience, and was a little scratchy, the fact that he won suggests a hunger for different ideas out there. That Trump's victory also, Trump ran against Wall Street and the global financial elite, which I hate what he did with it, but the fact that he could do that suggests, again, creative possibilities in American life that I think better politicians could exploit, right? And so I don't know what the ideal is. Like, I'm not gonna, play that game right now. What I do think is, I was listening to this podcast with Martha Nussbaum, the philosopher, the other day, and she gave, it was like so funny because it's like not like her, but she gave this enthusiastic endorsement to John Hickenlooper. And so then I was listening to a podcast with him. It's like the chain of podcasts. And to hear like this philosopher like endorse a president of Colorado governor. And the reason she gave is something I'd never heard in politics before, but struck me particularly in this era as a really good one to think about, which is she said he'd worked on himself more than almost anybody she's known. And he'd dealt with great grief, he'd lost a parent at a young age, and he'd worked on himself. And he'd grown, and he talks in the podcast about he used to be incredibly angry. And he's worked on it, so now he's like not at all angry. And it struck me that like what better repudiation of the Trump era than someone who's actually introspected and worked on themselves.
Anand, do you have a closing comment, something you didn't get said?
I am so happy to have this conversation with you all. I think what the most important thing to me these days and in these questions is not whether you like these rich people that I'm writing about or not. I think the more important question is like what you want for your society. I think what sometimes gets lost in these conversations is when did we start believing that the world is changed by Mark Zuckerberg throwing stuff down at you? When did that become our frame of change? And what would it mean to actually reorient our lives so that the next time you see something that disturbs you, that upsets you, that makes your heart hurt, you don't radically reorient your life, but you look through door B instead of door A. You just think about what it would mean to solve that problem for everybody at the root, instead of by someone's gilded whim.
Nice.
Thank you.
Larissa, Anand, we want to thank you so much. And now I'd like to invite everyone to finish the food, finish the wine, and Anand will be signing books over here at the left, which are available for purchase. And we thank you all deeply for coming, and come back again soon and often. Thank you.